I'm Megan, and thank you for being here with me. Today's practice I'm going to call Luscious Low Back and Happy Hips. It's a simple movement that we sometimes you'll see it referred to as the clock face movement for our pelvis. But it is great for all of the muscles in and around your pelvis, as well as helping to release your low back. And it's very simple. You'll typically see it done on its back side, which is where we're going to start. But I like to flip it over and put my own spin on it. Literally, we're going to spin. And the thing you'll need today is a soft blanket that I'm going to end up putting it at about this height. So a little bit of fluff in that blanket. So grab your blanket and we'll start down on our back. So come down onto the back, and if you know you're experiencing any pain in your hips or your lumbar spine, I encourage you to start with your feet on the ground and your knees bent. If you'd rather take your legs out long, you can do that as well. But I'm going to start from this position. Take your arms to your sides. And we want to start with this space of awareness, whether you feel your feet or your calves and your thighs on the ground. Come into the place of the pelvis and just notice the two sides of your pelvis. If you had a plumb line coming up the center of your body, feel your right hip and your left hip, and from the front, from the sides, from the back. Let's see if you can sense any differences. Does one hip feel higher or one lower? Does one feel lighter or heavier? Is there any difference? And if you ever want to use your hands, you could even take your hands and touch your hip bones, familiarize yourself with this space. And just let your mind's eye be present in this area. And if you want to bring your breathing into this, you can place your hands on your belly, right below the navel center. Take a nice belly breath. Imagine your abdomen like a balloon. Allow it to fill up as you breathe in. And gently release as you breathe out. Breathing is a really important part of releasing muscles in and around the pelvis and the low back. This abdominal breath will in itself encourage relaxation. And if you want to deepen that experience of relaxation, think every time you breathe out, let the weight of the bones around your pelvis, so your hip bones that you can touch in the front, around the sides, in your lumbar spine itself, just release into the ground. So if you have an understanding of the natural curve in your lumbar spine, there's 5 vertebrae there, and that's the place that much of us have trouble. And around the sacrum is you can slide your hands under there. There's probably a little bit of a space, right? A little arch there. And think what every time you breathe out, we'll take 5 more rounds of breath, just letting that arch release into the ground. We're not pressing it down. We're just letting the low back get longer. And if your legs are extended and that's not happening because you might notice there's more of an arch, then come into that bent knee position. So 3 more rounds of breath. Breathe into the belly. Feel spaciousness in and around the pelvis. And breathe out and just land. Let the weight of your body land in gravity, particularly the back of the pelvis and that curve in the lumbar area. So we've located ourselves, and we're going to locate first from the back side. So in the back of the pelvis, you have your tailbone all the way at the bottom of the spine. And I want you to imagine that tail, just like Milo over there has a tail. And now as you breathe in, just press the tail down into the ground. So what you'll feel when you do that is the arch will get bigger and your abdomen will rise up. And as you breathe out, release that. We'll just do that a few times. So know that if you have any sort of pain in the lumbar spine, if this is aggravating it, just do a very small one. But typically, if the pain is generally on the disc side, what we're actually doing when we're doing this back bend is we're creating spaciousness in that disc side where the pain may be, where the compression may be. But go slow. So you're breathing in. Imagine the belly like that big balloon, lifting the low back off the ground and arching it, and the tail goes down. So your tailbone is your 12 o'clock. We'll call that your 12 o'clock. You got to picture an old-fashioned clock. And do one more, rocking into it. And breathe out and just land. Release. So now we're going to take the exhalation. We're going to go the opposite way. So this is creating the arch and the curl. So now we're going to find our 6 o'clock. And the 6 o'clock is right at the top of, and the back side is the top of the area where it's arching, or think of the bottom of the rib cage, the high area of your low back. So now as you exhale and the belly empties, you're going to press the low ribs into the ground. And then breathe in and just release it. So I'm going to move my hands out of the way. Exhale, press into the ground. So what you'll notice now perhaps is a shortening in the front of the abdomen, where last time the back body was shortening, and a lengthening in that lumbar area. So exhale, press down. So this is your 6 o'clock. And notice how when you press your 6 o'clock down, the 12 o'clock rises up. Your tail is lifting up. You keep picturing it like a clock, because that's going to help you when we go into the full movement. And do 2 more, pressing down to the 6 o'clock on the exhale. You might also notice when you're pressing down a little bit of action in the backs of the thighs and the buttocks muscles. And 1 more exhale. So that creates what we call the arch and the curl. The arch on the inhale and the curl on the exhale. And that's also locating yourself in your 12 o'clock and your 6 o'clock. So now we're going to find our 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock. So if you imagine your right hip, and you can feel the front of the right hip, but feel the back of the bony landmark. And as you find that back right hip, press it into the ground. That's your 3 o'clock. And then just release it. And I like to do that on an inhalation, but you can do it on either breath, or just do it without thinking about the breath. So here's the interesting thing though, when we do this, when we do the 3 o'clock going down, is you can either make that movement by pushing the back of the right hip down, or see what it feels like to lift the left hip up. That's your 9 o'clock, your left hip. So making the same motion 2 different ways, pushing down into gravity with the right hip, or lifting up away from gravity, levity, with the left hip. But either way, feeling your right hip, that 3 o'clock, come deeper into the ground. We'll do 1 more there. Let your head and neck stay relaxed. And now let's do the same thing the other way. So your left hip is your 9 o'clock. And if we want to activate this movement from the left hip, you can push that left hip down and then just release. Something I watch for as you get better at this is you may find yourself pushing into the left foot and leg. And that's okay to start, but then see if you can keep the leg line more relaxed and really push the back part of your pelvis into the ground. And feel that rolling sensation, the way you're rolling onto the left hip through your sacrum, the right hip lifts. And then there's the option to make that same movement from the right hip. So instead of pushing down with the left, I think lifting up with the right. Here's another place to notice, is all that lifting coming by pushing into your foot? So sometimes smaller movements are better, versus keeping the leg line relaxed, and think of squeezing the muscles in and around the right hip to lift the right hip. So use the muscles in the hip. And you can do this either way or combination. So I'm getting into that 9 o'clock by either pressing into the 9 o'clock and or lifting the 3 o'clock. Let's do 1 more this way. And then we'll go back and forth with these 2. So you can go into your 3 o'clock or onto your 3 o'clock. Release. Always come to a full release in between if you can. And then on to your 9 o'clock and full release. So we keep building this understanding of our clock face. And then we get to have some fun with it. So you can see how we've done the 12, 3, 6, and 9. So tailbone, right hip, left hip. And I'm visualizing it right now from the back side of my body, because I like to use the floor for feedback. But we're going to change that up too. We'll see if we want to visualize it from the front. So now let's see if we can do all of those. So we would go 12 o'clock, tailbone into the ground, 3 o'clock, right hip into the ground. 6 o'clock, low back, low ribs into the ground. And 9 o'clock, left hip into the ground. And we keep going around really slow. Don't worry about your breath. Just make sure you're breathing comfortably, maybe to your belly. So back to the 12, the 3, the 6, and the 9. And use that floor for feedback. Push into the floor or lift away from the floor. So the freedom in the low back and the hips comes when we can make the same movement in different ways. So using different combinations of muscles. And it is different depending on whether we're choosing to push into the low back versus lifting the tailbone to come into our 6 o'clock. Or as I come into my 9 o'clock, I can push into the left hip, or I can lift my right hip, maybe a combination of the two. So I come into my 12 o'clock, I might push the tailbone down, or I might lift my abdomen or lift my low back. And then right hip, same thing. I can push into the right hip, or I can lift my left hip. Just do a few more so we're going in a clockwise direction. Keep the head and neck relaxed and see if the head and neck wants to just kind of take a little roll. The head and neck can sort of follow the roll of the pelvis. It's another place we have that curve in our spine. Let it enjoy the motion as well. If you find yourself building a lot of tension in your legs, stop for a moment, hug your knees in, or even take your legs straight up and just kind of pedal them out. We want to release the muscles in the legs, plop them back down. I felt some tension building there. And then let's try to go the opposite direction. So counterclockwise. And we go tailbone down, that's your 12 o'clock. Left hip down, 9 o'clock. Low back, lower ribs down, tailbone lifts. There's your 6 o'clock. And 3 o'clock onto the right hip. So same movement, just switching the flow of the direction. And you can switch the direction of your head as well if you'd like, if your head's moving. So you can see I like to keep my hands here because where I have the floor to feel the movement and to make those decisions, because everything is voluntary here. We're actively moving ourselves between pushing in or pulling away. The pushing in, I can use the floor for that feedback, push into gravity to create force. But if I'm lifting away, I can even place a hand on the hip or on the belly and lift up into my hand. Do a few more in that direction. And then see if you want to get a little playful and just switch directions a few times. So take a couple rounds one way and go the other way. And the other thing now is we've found those 4 cornerstones of the clock, but add all the rest of the numbers in. So go really, really slow. Like imagine if I were to put my camera on slow-mo right now. Put your body in slow-mo. Go all the way around and notice the way the muscles are coordinating this movement for you. When do you feel stretching in your skin on your abdomen? And when that happens, you might notice your low back is shortening, contracting. If that doesn't feel good, don't go so far into that one. But then when do you feel the low back lengthen and the front abdominal muscles tighten? When do you feel tightening in one hip while the other hip stretches? Maybe switching the direction. Also notice if your body tries to skip out, if you're truly touching each one of the numbers to the ground all the way around, where is that place where it's harder to get down? Go even slower through that. You might even feel kind of jumpy or sticky. Take 1 or 2 more rounds. And then just pause for a moment, either knees bent, or if you'd rather extend your legs and that's comfortable, you can do that. I like to keep my knees bent. I'm going to let my knees fall together though for a little more spaciousness in the back body. Hands back at the belly and just pause for a moment. Feel into the space of low back and hips again. And where sometimes we don't, if we're having some chronic pain, we may not have a immediate release of the pain. We do have perhaps just more awareness of this area in our body. And having awareness in the area when it's not in pain or there's no sensation is still an improvement, right? We want to begin to make friends with these areas that might be grumpy. And so one of the ways we do that is not expecting the pain necessarily to completely disappear just by doing a couple clock faces, but by being present in this area without sensation, or maybe with a dulling of the sensation, and just breathing there. 3 more rounds of breath. Feel your belly rise. Notice as your belly rises, you might even feel the back side of the body gently pressing into the ground. And as you breathe out, let the back side of the body just fall into the ground. Let it be received by the ground. The bones are holding you and the muscles are relaxed. All right, so we're going to get ready to make it a little more playful. So this is my version of the clock face on the front side, and this is where you're going to want to bring the blanket in. Please feel free to roll to one side to come up. Use your hands. So I'm going to take my blanket in, and I'm going to put it across the mat. Again, I have this is a good thickness. It's probably a good inch thick in my blanket. That's what I like. You don't want too much or too little. Put it across the length of your mat. Then you're going to come down, and that blanket's going to be right underneath your upper thighs to about your navel center. So your whole pelvis is being framed out and has that nice padding. And this is a nice way to go because what it does too is it encourages you to lengthen the low back when we get in our front side. So here we are. And when you come down, you can rest on your chin or your forehead. You could use your arms as a pillow, wherever your arms are most comfortable. I always have mic duty here, so my head's not always where I want to be when I'm recording. But for you, be wherever it is that's most comfortable. Once you get there, first just take your legs and jelly roll your legs a little bit. And by the way, if you have cramping in your feet when you do this, which is very common, I've got a second blanket here. What you want to do is just do a little roll. And you can put the tops of your feet, the tops of your ankles, right on that blanket so you don't get cramping in your feet. Now this is really comfortable. And then let your thighs just rock on the ground. Let your hips go back and forth, letting the front body settle. And this side's maybe a little bit easier to understand because those 12, 3, 6, and 9 are going to be the same, but we want to visualize it from the front side now. So think of your 12 o'clock again as your tailbone. And if you want to do it on your exhalation, we're going to push the tailbone down. You don't have to do it on your exhalation, but think of pushing the tailbone down. And notice how now when you do that, there's going to be a tightening through your gluteal muscles and your hamstrings and a lengthening of the low back. So push 12 o'clock into the ground and then release. Push it down and release. And generally this one feels really good because we're lengthening that low back. We're encouraging some of these supporting muscles, these muscles of propulsion that really we have to have them working to have that health in our hips and our back. We're turning them on a little bit. And you're just pushing the front of the pelvis down, the bottom of the pelvis. You can even think of your hip crease in the front. That might be a good area for you to imagine. We're pushing the 12 down and releasing. And then we're going to switch the direction. So we're going to go again to the 6 o'clock next. So we did 12. So now with the 6 o'clock was the low back or low rib. So if you translate that to your front side, think just above your navel center, around your navel center. And I want you to push just above the navel center. Think of the bottom of the ribs. Push it into the ground. And then release. And what you'll notice here, especially with the blanket in the right spot, is that your low back is arching or shortening. You're getting a bigger curve in your low back. You might feel your butt pop up in the air. And the front body, the abdomen is stretching. And I like to do this one on an inhale. I push my 6 o'clock down. The other thing you can think of is lifting the tailbone up, right? Just like on the front side, there's two ways to create that movement is by pushing down into gravity or lifting away from gravity. And then let's put these two together. So if I want to do it to my breath, and you don't have to, again, it's always optional, I'm going to inhale and push into the upper abdomen, feel the tailbone lift. Exhale, push into the tailbone, and you might even feel the abdomen lift a little bit. So it's that same pelvic tilt from the front. Inhale, you're coming into your arch. Your low back is arching by pressing into the abdomen. You're exhaling, tailbone pushing down. There's your 12 o'clock. And the low back is lengthening as the abdomen lifts. So inhale, 6 o'clock down into the ground. Exhale, 12 o'clock into the ground. Just notice the way your muscles are firing when you feel stretching. And a lot of times the skin is a good place to notice the difference between where you feel stretching and where you feel compression or activation of the muscles. Remembering sometimes one direction is going to be more comfortable for you than the other. So go further in the direction that brings release and comfort, pleasant experience, and using the movement choices between pushing into and pulling away from to create the greatest amount of motion with the most pleasure. Do one or two more here. And then relax. So this is where it gets a little more interesting because we're going to do that 3 and 9 o'clock, but on the front side. So once again, picture your right hip. That was your 3 o'clock. And your left hip is your 9 o'clock. Just notice those first. And then when you're ready, you're going to push your 3 o'clock into the ground and release. Let's just work on that one a few times. Push your right hip, your 3 o'clock into the ground and release. You might notice your pelvis is taking just a little bit of a rotation. And now you can really feel the way the left hip is lifting, right? You can even sense that it's coming up off the ground. Put your hand under there. So there's those choices again between making this motion by pushing into the right versus lifting the left. Just this nice little bit of a rotation for the pelvis. And if you have pain in the lumbar spine or the sacrum in one side, in my case it's sacrum, you're going to find rocking one way is going to be more soothing and the other way might be a little more uncomfortable. So just go smaller on the uncomfortable side. Little bits. And then let's switch. Find your way into your 9 o'clock. So now we're visualizing the front of the hip. You can even feel your left hip bone there. Push that left hip bone down and release. Push it down and release. And so what I find, we have something in somatics we call sensory motor amnesia, which is when the muscles just aren't awake. They're not awake, they're not aware. And when we have low back or hip issues, you may find, I find especially when I flip over like this, like when I went to push my right hip into the ground, it was no problem, everything fired. But when I go to push my left hip or my 9 o'clock in, I really have to think about making those muscles engage. It's not involuntary. So that just shows me that one side of my pelvis is a lot more willing to work and the other one's on holiday. So play with that. And then once you've found both sides, go back and forth. So we're putting our right hip down, 3 o'clock, and then complete release, equal weight into both hips. That's really important, coming back to what I call the base of grace, where we're just relaxed. And then left hip pushing down and releasing. Or remember, you can make the same motion by lifting up. So as I'm pushing the left hip down, I might also lift the right hip up. And my right side is being a little lazy. I have to think about using the right hip to lift up. So that's another trick, is that if you find something is more difficult to do, it might be really easy to push the left hip down, but more difficult to lift the right hip to get into that 9 o'clock, then by all means, Try the thing that's a little more difficult. And difficult does not mean more painful. It just means it's not awake. You want to reprogram those muscles. Notice if one cheek tightens in your buttocks and then the other. And relax. So now we'll go all the way around again, and then I'm going to give you some options to make the movement a little more bigger, a little more sensational, and you may or may not need that. But first, let's start with the tailbone down, 12 o'clock, right hip down, 3 o'clock, low belly, low ribs down, 6 o'clock, left hip down, 9 o'clock. So that same motion we did before, just feeling it from your front side. And remembering we can go down, or we can think what's lifting up, and do we want to create that force by lifting up? So as the right hip goes down, I could lift the left hip. As I come into my 12 o'clock, I could lift my tailbone versus pressing the belly down. Left hip goes down, I might lift my right hip. Or as the tailbone goes down, I might even lift my belly a little bit. Do a few more. And all these muscles we take for granted the coordination of, and just stay present and feel it. We want to switch the direction and go counterclockwise. I always notice when I go to switch, it takes a moment for my brain to reprogram itself. So we can continue onward, just letting the legs stay relaxed. Or the way that I sort of deepen this pelvic clock face is if you think about the position of your legs in the first one, we had our knees bent with feet on the floor. But try to take a similar position by bending your knees, place your heels just above the backs of your knees. So your legs are in an L shape, and your thighs are parallel to the floor, and your shins are about 90 degrees. And then doing that same motion. So now when you push down into the belly, you might lift your legs just a little bit. So notice, I'm going to stop there for a moment. When I push down into the belly, my 6 o'clock, what I notice is there's a lot more tightening through the hamstrings and the glutes. So I'm activating those muscles more, but I'm also shortening my lumbar spine more. So you got to make sure that's comfortable. If you want a little bit more, you can even lift your body. So what we're doing now is we're truly creating a back bend, lifting up. But then I'm going to release the body down. I started from the 6 o'clock. So then if I'm going into my we'll go in order. Left hip, 9 o'clock. I'm going to push down into 9 o'clock. My left hip, I might even lift my right hip up a little bit. So you want to go slower through this. So you can see my right hip lifting. And then as I come down into the 12 o'clock, that's tailbone down, pushing down there. I can even lift my back. I sort of slide and create more of a curl in my back. Lift the belly up and release that. Right hip goes down into the ground. That's my 3 o'clock. I might lift the left hip up. Push through that heel. Take that down. As the belly comes down, I can push the belly down, but I can also lift the legs up. I could also lift the torso up. Take your time. Release that. Coming around, I'm going to come on to my left hip. So as I come on to my left hip, pressing in. So you can even press left thigh into the ground. Notice how you get more action through the hamstrings and the glutes. But you could lift the right leg up, and that will bring more action into the right side glutes. Release that. Feel your 12 o'clock push into the 12 o'clock. So the front of the pubic bone, tailbone down. And if you want, you can even think tailbone down, lift your back a little bit. See how that feels? Release that. Right side, pressing into your 3 o'clock. Push your right hip down. You can push the front of the right thigh into the ground. You could also lift the left leg up. And release. So going a little slower through this one. It's a little bit more difficult to flow it. And then the 6 o'clock belly down. I'm in my right brain now. And when you do that one, option to lift the legs, option to lift the body. But notice how much more compression you're creating, and does that feel okay? And more importantly, when you're coming down, are you releasing the compression? If you're not, take those legs down, shift your hips side to side again. So let's do the same thing. We'll just switch the direction. And I'll start from the 12 o'clock. So if you're at 12 o'clock, if you want, you can bend your knees, or you're still doing it with your legs long. Push your tailbone down into the floor. Maybe so much so that you lift the front of the hips up, lift the abdomen, draw the abdomen in. And then release that. Come into your 3 o'clock by pushing into your right hip. Oh, wait, sorry, we're going to go the other direction. Switch around. Pushing into your left hip, go into your 9 o'clock. You can push the front of the thigh down. You can also lift the right thigh up. And take that down. And then the 6 o'clock. The 6 o'clock, you want to push into the front of the abdomen or the lower rib cage in the front. You can lift your tailbone, and maybe that's enough. You can also just lift the upper body and leave the legs on the floor. But if you're looking to engage more through the back line of the legs, some of those supporting muscles of the low back and the pelvis, then lift the legs up. And release that one. We'll go around one more time that direction. So finishing it off, we're at the 9 o'clock. We'll go to the 3 o'clock, pushing into the right hip. Left hip might lift up. Hold it there for a few breaths. Let it come down, completely release. Last round. Feel the front of the pelvis, picture those places. Press the tailbone down into the ground, or think of the front of the pubic bone now. Push that down. And as you push the pubic bone down, you can feel the abdomen begin to lift a little bit. You've got that softness of the blanket, right? So push into the blanket. And you can lift and arch your back a little bit. Release that. Come into your 9 o'clock, so left hip. You can push the front of the left hip and thigh into the ground. You might lift up your right thigh and hip. Release that. Coming into the 6 o'clock, push into the belly. You'll feel the way your tailbone will lift. If you want to add to that, legs can lift up, and or front body lifts up, creating what we call back bend, extension of the spine. And release that. And then finally, that 3 o'clock, right hip. Roll onto it, push into it if you'd like to. Maybe lift the left side. And release that. If you've been doing with your knees bent, take your legs down again, just shake them out. And do some nice rolls, either just side to side, back and forth. And then use your hands. We'll come back onto our back side again. You can remove the blanket if you'd like. Come back on the back side. We're just going to do a little bit of stretching here. Bring the right leg into your body. Feel free to extend your left leg if it's comfortable. Otherwise, if it pulls on your back, keep the knee bent. And then just gently move the right hip in the socket just a little bit, really slow. So you can create another clock face here with just the right thigh bone in the socket. And you can go both directions. And then hug that leg in one more time. We're going to do a thread the needle to finish. So if your left leg was extended, bring it in, cross the right ankle on the left thigh. So I like to start right here with this one, thread the needle, and think of lengthening the right thigh bone away from you. You might push it a little bit. And then instead of drawing the leg in, which you often see drawing the left leg in, just do a few of those 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock movements. We know that one, right? 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. See how that feels. Can you notice the It's more of like an organic change of where you're feeling the stretching, where you're feeling the strengthening. And you can even do that clock face movement with the leg in this position. And that can feel really yummy. So now that we've added the clock face to our repertoire, there's lots of ways to bring it in. Instead of just holding this leg and being still, explore movement. The fluidity of movement is often what can help us to release and relax. You can go both directions. If you're looking for a little more strengthening as you do this, you can lift the left leg up off the floor and do that same clock face. And then you're going to have to recruit more of the muscles, your core muscles, because you don't have the support of the floor under the left leg. But I'm still creating that slow clock face movement. You're also going to get a little more stretch through that right hip if you're lifting the left leg up. But just creating these circles. And then if you like a still point, foot can stay on the floor or hold the back of the thigh and take 3 to 5 breaths in stillness. Give your pelvis, your low back some loving kindness, a compliment. And release. We'll switch sides. So bring the left leg in, say hello, thank you, left leg. Right foot can stay on the ground, and generally that's more comfortable for low back, or you can extend only if it feels good, stretching into the top of the thigh. And then feel where your thigh bone comes right into your hip and just make some small circles, like you're doing a clock face from the hip crease all the way around. Really slow, like you're drawing circles with your kneecap. And you can switch the direction. It's like you're just hydrating, lubricating your left hip. Let your low back relax. It's supported by the ground again. And if your right leg is extended, bring it in. Place the foot on the floor. Cross the left ankle on the right thigh. Just pause there for a moment to feel, and then a lot of times that left hip crease will get tightened up towards your shoulder. So gently press the left thigh away from you, keeping the pelvis more equal, the 2 hip bones. So no tilting on that left side. And then see if you want to do your arch coming into your 12 o'clock and your curl into your 6 o'clock. Starting with those little movements, because even the tiniest movements create change in our body. And the way we heal is to stay present for those changes, recognizing the difference between what increases discomfort, what decreases discomfort, and what just doesn't have a response at all. And that's okay too, because that is part of the healing. And then if that feels okay, open it up into the full clock face. So you can go into the 12 o'clock at the tail, 6 o'clock into the right hip, 3 o'clock into the right hip, 9 o'clock into the low back, low ribs. I goofed again, 6 o'clock. I'm getting a little too relaxed here. The 9 o'clock is the left hip. So 12, tailbone, 3, right hip, low back, low ribs, 6, and left, 9 o'clock. And you can go the opposite direction. Let your head be free, your neck. Just feel all the support underneath your shoulders, your back. The ground will hold you, and you just have to be willing to receive that support. Sometimes we hold tension in our bodies because we just don't recognize where we can find support in gravity. And then if you want a little bit more muscular action, you can do these same rolls with the right foot off the ground. And then I sort of engage more by drawing the thighs together. Imagine pushing into the left heel, hug the inner thighs. I'm going to start to recruit some of the deeper abdominal core muscles. but still getting that nice stretch through the outer left hip and leg that most people appreciate, and that's why they like this thread the needle pose. But find those bony landmarks on the back, rolling around through the left hip, the tailbone, the right hip, and the low back and low ribs. And find a place to settle, and that can be with the foot on the ground. You can just hang here or draw the right thigh in towards you. What we want to watch if we're drawing the right thigh in is that what I often see is up here, the shoulders are tight and the head's off the ground. So you really don't want that. You want to be able to release. So if you can't easily grab your thigh, just place your foot on the ground and press the left thigh away, or you can always use a strap behind the thigh. So shoulder blades are on the ground, base of the skull relaxed. So you can focus more on the hips and the lengthening of the low back. 3 to 5 breaths here. You can breathe into the belly. And come out of that, knees bent, maybe knees fall together or legs long. Hands back to the belly. Where we started to just feel the backside, do that one more time. We'll land and locate. So anything that's touching the ground, whether it be your feet, your calves, your thighs, the pelvis, the back and spine, the shoulders, the base of the skull. Feel that. Land in all the spaces that are touching the ground, supported by the earth. And then locate yourself in your hips and your low back. Think of that connection point at the sacrum between your spine and your hips. That sacred sacrum takes all the weight of your upper body and distributes it into your hips and eventually down your legs and into the earth. Visualize yourself from the front and the back and the sides, all the way around the pelvic bowl. Notice if anything feels different. The beginning, we were checking to see if one hip felt heavier or lighter, higher or lower, tighter or looser, just more awareness. Can you picture, are you able to be present in the space in your hips differently than when we started the practice, or in your low back differently? 3 more rounds of breath into the abdomen. Let the breath expand and create space in and around the abdomen and in the pelvis itself, the low back. And as you breathe out, just willing to receive the ground, the support underneath you. Feel free to rest here for more time if you have it. Take it for yourself. Otherwise, you can roll to one side to come up, using your hands to support yourself. Thank you for joining me for this practice, and I hope it was really lovely for your hips, happy hips, and luscious low back. This is a practice I do both for maintenance for healthy back and also when I am in any sort of chronic pain. I am able typically to do these. So I hope it's something that you can put in your tool chest for yourself. Thanks, patrons, for supporting me and for all your comments. And remember to subscribe to my channel. Peace, joy, love, and light.